Good. Okay. Hello. Thank you for coming down. I know it's a bit of a trek from the main square, so thank you for making it down here. Today's talk that I've been asked to give is about data in investigative reporting. So there's been a lot of panels coming out today over the past couple days talking about data journalism, talking about investigative journalism, and I'm specifically going to talk about what we're doing at the Times and the Sunday Times and how we're using data journalism as it's called today. But I just wanted to first start off with a little bit about data journalism, because I think everyone does it a bit differently. Some of you might know about the Guardian data blog, which is quite well known for bringing in outsiders and allowing them to publish all kinds of visualizations on their piece. They were some of those in the forefront of bringing forward data visualization into the public space. You might know about something called AMPT that kind of is no longer around, but they were really well known for giving you bite-sized pieces of what was going on in the news lately and help people digest what was happening. You've got the Financial Times. You've got tons of papers here in Italy that are doing great visualizations and great ways of telling stories. But as you probably have guessed, everyone's doing it a bit different. We're all just trying to figure out how to swim in all of this data at the moment. With the Panama Papers that have just been released, this is more prevalent than ever. And this is something that's really, really relevant to our team at the Times and really relevant to journalism at the moment. I'm of the belief that this is now the future of journalism. So what we're seeing at Panama Papers, what we're seeing with WikiLeaks, Swiss Leaks, HSBC files, anything really across the board that we're seeing influx of data into the newsroom, this is now the future of what journalism is going to look like. I argue that data journalism is a redundant statement. It is just journalism. That's what I'm trying to do at the Times and the Sunday Times, is integrating data completely into the newsroom. I don't want it to be something supplementary. So my team does not focus on visualization. We don't want to try to think about how we tell stories at the moment. And we don't do the kind of bite-sized explainers either, because we don't want to focus on adding to the story. We want to be the story. We want the data to be the foundation of our journalism. Not to say that we don't do visualizations at the Times or we don't do analysis or explanation of a story, but my specific team has been brought in to do something very, very unique, and that is to bring data and computing, as I'm going to talk about today, directly into our journalism. So that's what we're going to talk about. That's basically my overview. We're going to walk through some of the investigations that we've done, and I'm going to talk a bit as well about the general election in the UK that our team called out accurately when the polling data was wrong. So that's kind of the premise of what we're looking at. So to start off with, to get an idea of why and how we started the team at the Times and the Sunday Times, I just want to bring up that this was data journalism, or journalism as we knew it, in 1868 at the Times. So this is a fantastic piece from our archive, just contextualizing the census. So if you have a read of it, all they're taking is the census data, which to them was a lot of information. It was about everyone living in the UK, and it was about whether they were married, whether they were single, if they had children, where they were living, what they were doing. And they contextualize it in this really unique way to explain it and to synthesize it. And I think this is the foundation of where we started when we start thinking about data journalism at the Times. Is we said, well, we've been doing this for ages. We've been explaining something complex. We've been taking lots of information and digesting it, and we've been giving it to our readers in a way that's understandable, that is tangible, and that's not overwhelming. So for us, data journalism in this sense is not new. We go back even outside of ourselves. We might know the famous example of John Snow, who questioned the idea that cholera was being spread through the air. And he sat and he plotted, as you see up here on this map, he plotted where all these deaths were happening across London and mapped that against the water wells that were distributed throughout the city, and was able to find that actually, and prove into the city that cholera was being spread through the water systems, and the sanitation was really poor in London. This was investigative journalism, taking different sets of data, mapping it together, finding stories, investigating, questioning truths, and digging and finding the data about it. So we think about data as anything that you can digitize today, but then and now and forever, it is just information. So again, so we said, okay, this isn't new either. We think about data visualization. Florence Nightingale was one of the people who spearheaded this. In 1858, she published these incredible charts, the rose charts as we kind of call them now, that looked at the Crimean War and looked at in the hospitals that she was visiting and why all these people were dying and when they were dying. And she plotted this out. As you can see, going around each month shows when people were dying and when people were ill and when people were sick. And she was able to prove that there was a reduction in this when new sanitation measures came in. And she was a pioneer for changing the sanitation systems in the UK. But this was visualization, and this is complex visualization, as you can see, in 1858. So we know this isn't new. And I just use one last example from data visualization because I'm going to talk about the election later. But election mapping is not new. 1895, this really old piece, this was published in the Times. This was our election results. And the Times had gone through and created these box squares to show each constituency and where it had gone. And then you see on the other hand side is the Telegraph actually in 2015. So not only is data visualization nothing new, mapping is nothing new, election maps are nothing new. And actually, as you can see, our country hasn't changed very much either. So it's quite an interesting idea. And I just take this moment to show you a little bit about this history because we are in an age when I think data is getting really sexy for people. And I never thought I would say data and sexy in the same sentence, but it really is getting to be quite sensational right now. And I think we're focusing so much on what we can do rather than the sort of new means and the new tools and the new technology to advance journalism. So like I said, the Times wanted to sit and say, data journalism and reporting isn't new, and these visualizations aren't. So what can we do that will make it new? How can we reinvent data journalism for the Times? The Times is known for being the paper of record. We're known for being distinct, and we wanted to keep that tradition going. So we had to really think about what that would be. So 3 years ago, the Times said, there's all this data going around, we should set up a team. And they set up 3 of us. We were a tiny, itty-bitty team. They hired a statistician, which is actually quite unheard of in the UK, and myself and a programmer. And we were just this bitty little team, and they just had no idea other than there's data out there, do something about it. But we decided we wanted to be distinct from what I just told you earlier. So we decided that we wanted to make our focus to be a computational investigative team. And it's not as daunting or as scary as it might sound, but using computational methods to advance investigations and accountability. So our idea is that the newsroom is filled with people who deal with data every day, who deal with the census, who deal with visualization, who handle reports and information all the time. What they wanted our team, and what we wanted our team to do, was to handle information in a way that a human could never do without computing. So although our team could run around and we could help with various stories on basic kind of data levels, our skill set, we thought, would be best utilized, and we can advance investigations at the Times if we were used in a way that, like I said, was available when humans couldn't do it. You had to have computers, and we're talking modeling, we're talking big data, but we're just talking scraping, investigating, scaling the data that is available in a way that a human couldn't do it. And maybe a human could do it, but it would take you years. It would take you weeks. It would take you days. And as we know at the moment, time is very precious in the newsroom. I don't know how many of you are feeling kind of the pressures of this, but I know in our newsroom at the moment and across in my colleagues at other papers, newsrooms are scaling. They're becoming smaller. They're becoming tighter. There's cuts happening across the board. People are having to churn stories out very quickly. So our team is meant to sort of speed up that process, to do the kind of hard work. And the best way that I like to tell people about how we can best be utilized is to imagine that you had 1,000 interns at your disposal. What story would you do? If you could put someone on a project and you didn't have to worry about it, you can just give a bunch of interns a project to do, what would it be? And I challenge you to think about that, because that is what we're doing at the moment. We write scripts and programs so that they are doing this work constantly. So anyways, we set up this computational investigative team. This is what we look like at the moment. We're quite tiny. As I mentioned, we've got statistician, the PhD in data mining and machine learning. We have two programmers that they're programmer/journalists. They're trained in both coming from data science backgrounds and training in journalism as well, and journalists. And this team is sort of the core team, and we work across the Times and the Sunday Times, which are two completely different papers. So we're technically working for two different newsrooms, and we expand and contract as and when a story gets bigger or smaller, or what the kind of things we need. During the election, I hired an additional statistician for some of our investigations. We latched onto the insight team or investigative teams, but we basically expand and contract. But this is sort of the core unit, and like I said, we definitely focus on using programmatic measures. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of how this team came to be. So like I said, we were set up 3 years ago, and the problem was, although we had this great strategy, we were going to be the computational investigative team. It's hard making change in the newsroom. The Times is 230 years old. It's an old, beautiful institution, but it has its ways and its production of how it does things. So if you can imagine a bunch of young hacks and hackers coming in saying, we're going to change the way this works, that didn't exactly go down very well. So we had to be very strategic in how we did that. And it was small, little steps of influence. So it did start with us being the Excel help. Sometimes we helped people print. Yes, that is what we did. And we just built bridges, and we helped people understand data. So one of the first stories, and I always mention this because at the time I was so begrudging to work on it, the prescriptions database in the UK is published every month. So every single month, the NHS publish a set of data of every drug that is prescribed by every GP to every patient that has asked for it. That's actually a lot of drugs. There's 4 million rows of data every month. And the news desk said, this is really interesting. You're a data team. You should be able to do this. And we said, yes, this is great. I don't want to work on printers anymore. I don't want to work on Excel sheets anymore. What can we do? And they said, we're trying to download this. We can't open it. And of course, Excel cannot handle that amount of data. So our team came in, and we were able to programmatically hold the database together. And we said, okay, let's query it. What do we want to look at? Sunday Times said, we want to see those that have erectile dysfunction across the country. And our team just frustrated. This was our moment to shine, and this is what we're working on, is looking where erectile dysfunction was throughout the country. Where were these Viagra pills being prescribed? We knew already what that was going to look like. It was going to look at the older populations of the country. It was going to be on the outskirts. But we said, okay, we'll do this. But being the means that we did this, like I said, we're not just a team that goes through and pulls down information and churns it back out. We are critical thinkers. We have, like I said, our statisticians. So we said, we can't compare areas, right, unless we understand how we can compare them. There's a small little town out in the country, and then you've got London. You can't compare those two together. So we wanted to look at the number of prescriptions that were given per population size. So we had to go through and also pull down for every region, what is the population there, what is the size of patients that are going to those GPs, and then the prescription size. And as we were doing that, we found this really strange thing, which is there were more people that were registered at the GPs, at the doctors, than there were in the population of that constituency. And this was a bit odd. How is that possible? The census says there's this X many people, and the doctors are saying there's X many people. And that led to a story about ghost patients. So if you can see there on the map, our patient population ratio was 126% for Cambridge. That doesn't seem right, does it? You can see the number of patients exceeded the population. So this, although it was a very kind of mundane exercise about looking at Viagra and erectile dysfunction across the country, it led to this fascinating story in which we analyzed 3 years of ghost patients throughout the country, which essentially, when you maybe have done this before, you move house and you forget to unregister from a GP, or sometimes it's something in the records that's not going through. And this was an interesting piece that came through, and we were able to write about ghost patients. So this was the start of our team. We were a supporting unit. We really were someone else's idea, someone else's vision, something they couldn't do, often with a very mundane task to start with. And things like this allowed us to start proving the power of statistical thinking, of data manipulation, and journalism, all combined together. And obviously the ghost patient story was much bigger than the Viagra story, and that started to give us some more notoriety. So we did a lot of stories like this, and we started building up until we finally really are now what we envisioned ourselves to be, and now we are a key component of investigations. These are 3 front page splashes we've had recently. A couple years ago, the tax avoidance scheme, which now is snowballed into the fantastic findings coming out of the Panama Papers. But the tax avoidance scheme that we worked on a couple years ago was, again, we'd proven ourselves a little bit in the newsroom, and they came to us now. There was a source that came to our investigations team that said, this is the Liberty tax scheme, a series of people who are on this very specific scheme called Liberty, and they have offshore investments, and we have them all on this list. It was a piece of paper handed to us with coffee stains on it. It was things were scratched all over it. The alignment of the columns were horizontal. They were crooked, but we were excited. There was data coming to us. So what can you do with this? So we digitized the list. We keep a lot of software for converting PDFs and converting documents into Excel. We cleaned it up, and it was fascinating that people would actually be registering themselves on these tax avoidance schemes with their personal emails, and with their phone numbers and with all kinds of information. Because oftentimes, if you're trying to do a matching exercise between a politician and an offshore investment, a name like John Brown is a very common name, and you cannot verify that that is that exact politician in that offshore account. So having additional metadata is extremely important in this case, and this is what we had. So we ran it against every possible database you can think of. We ran it against political donors, NHS trust members, the lawyers. We ran it through LinkedIn. I think we learned through that, like I said, the amount of personal emails that people came through. And we came out with all kinds of stories about people you would have never thought to find. You know, you can see those really big names if you scan through the list. Oh, wow, Jimmy Carr's on this list. But we were able to find all kinds of really influential people who the public wouldn't know, who were on this list. And that was a fascinating example of, like I said, using database building, computing, and matching to lead this investigation. And obviously, this tax avoidance investigation led to a lot of public accountability since then. Our chancellor has since spoken about going after these tax avoiders, which will be quite interesting considering all the revelations that have come out today, with our own prime minister being linked in the Panama Papers. So anyways, moving on to the GPs awarded these deals to their own companies. The headline that we have there on the side, this was an interesting piece as well, where we were looking at clinical commissioning groups. So these are doctors who are on commissioning groups that give grants or they buy services through the NHS for various things. So it might be, like I said, a drug company, or it might be supply companies or whatever it is. And by just simply looking at a list of registered interests of doctors, directors of companies, and having clinical commissioning group chiefs, lists of each of these things, we matched them together and looked at the various contracts that were awarded, and we were able to come up with £2.4 billion a year is awarded to these doctors. And just this past week, the Cultural Secretary has come out with this, and head of the NHS basically saying this cannot happen anymore, and doctors will be banned if they are working in areas where their interests crossover. So that was a fantastic, again, lead into accountability. And the last one I have over there on the side is we've also been finding most recently about charities. So we drove through tons and tons and tons of documents on financial records of charities that list who their boss is and who are anyone that's earning over 30,000, over 60,000, over 100,000 pounds being paid. And we actually found that there are quite a few charities that are earning more than the Prime Minister, and who have up to 12% of the earnings that come in for these charities are going directly into the pockets of these CEOs, which obviously when you're giving to a charity, you don't want 12% of what's going there to go directly to a CEO, a head of a charity. So this was an interesting lead to that. And actually, although the charity sector was quite upset about this because they come under a lot of scrutiny and their fear that, you know, people would stop donating, actually a lot of public sector and charity workers kind of came through saying this was a very clean analysis, something that they hadn't seen in any other newspaper. And this was a really great moment for us to sort of build bridges with people that were criticizing in the media. And we started becoming this sort of trusted team that can analyze and criticize fairly. And we're doing it, like I said, through data. So these are instances where we're using computing, and hopefully they will foster your own ideas about stories as well, about some things to look into. But this has been really important for our team. And I'll lead into a couple other of our big investigations to give you an idea of some of the power behind what we're doing. So the FIFA files might be something that you're familiar with, corruption in the FIFA body. So these are 3 front-page stories that have come through out of the back of this work. And it was a fantastic thing that has now led to all kinds of scrutiny about how FIFA operates. But to give you a little bit of an idea of how that came about, showing up here on this slide, we have an inbox that we created for people to look at. So what the dump was that we were given this database because, one, our team has started to be known for handling data. But 2, the Sunday Times was the paper who broke that Lance Armstrong had been doping. David Walsh, one of the most renowned journalists in our newsroom, and worked over 10 years of his life dedicating to chasing Lance Armstrong and to proving that he had been doping. And so we were really well known for that. And so they came to us afterwards with saying, there's more corruption and there are more things happening too. So being known for sports data and data analysis, people came to us for that. So this dump came in, and it was a trove of emails. That's all it was emails. And my editor sort of said, I don't know if you can do anything with this. It's emails. It's text. It's not data. And I had to very carefully explain to him, data is anything you can digitize. We can digitize sound if you want. So that's really fascinating. That's a really interesting idea. I wonder what you could do with these emails. So hence, this is what we looked at. So without even looking at what was inside the very text of these emails, we just looked at, we scraped all these PDFs, all these documents, and we looked at the to, the from, the subject line, and the timestamp. And we just started with that. That's all we did. And the modular network that you see up here is the result of that. So purely by taking the metadata around these documents, and again, you have to remember thinking about data in a way that can be in text form or in email form, we found this network of communication. So the center of that is Bin Hammam's personal assistant. So this is sort of the chief personal assistant. And as you can see, it starts to branch out in all kinds of conversations that are happening. And this analysis was very much, like I said, we didn't publish this for our readers. We published the inbox for our readers. We knew the readers would want to go through and have an idea and look at the text of it. But this was for us. This was for leading our journalists, leading our investigative teams, and leading ourselves to finding the stories there. So we started looking at these little branches that were happening on the side, and we said, let's have a look at this cluster of conversations. And we looked in and we started looking at these emails. And he said, thank you very much for your lunch today. I had a very interesting conversation. Here's a bank transaction to thank you what you're about to do for me. And all the sort of connected conversations came through. Whereas if you were just sitting and reading through troves and troves of mixed emails, you'd have to piece those things together. But we created a network with the data set to be able to lead us down that investigative path, which, like I said, was a massive tool for the investigative teams to do that. So this is, like I said, one instance in which you're showing the power of computing to be crucial for the leading of journalism. And a lot more of our work on this was not as seen externally. This was much more of an internal tool. Next, I'm going to talk about the doping scandal, which is another big piece of ours that came out last year. We worked a lot more hands-on with this story than we did with the FIFA files. So obviously, as I mentioned, after the David Walsh investigation to Lance Armstrong, after FIFA files, we started to be known for sports data and handling that kind of database. So someone within the IAAF came to us and said, there is wrongdoing. I cannot see this happening anymore. I want to see something done about it. So they leaked to us blood results of athletes for 11 years, and we found 12,000 blood tests in there, over 5,000 athletes, and we found through analysis that there were over 146 metals under suspicion. So initially, this wasn't what you would find in the database. The database was just a series of names and a series of blood results, the instruments that were used for every blood sample that was taken. It was tested for hemoglobin. It was tested for a series of reticulite measures, all kinds of measures that the doctors would be looking at. But we then had to go and make sense of all of this. So one of the first things we did actually is we said, there's so many people in here and people that people don't probably know. So let's see who we do know. And we went and looked at 11 years of data at the same time period of medal winners in the Olympics and World Championships. So we said, let's just start with that. Let's just see if there's anyone from the Olympics or World Championships in there. And that's how we got the 146 medals that were under suspicion. So just looking at medal winners, we matched that database. Once we built this database of medals and database of winners, we matched that back through into the blood database and said, where do these people line up? And it was fascinating to see that come through. Again, we then didn't go and analyze this data by ourselves. We went to the leading experts on anti-drug doping, those who were part of the inquiry into Lance Armstrong, those who invented the EPO test that tests for that particular drug use. And we had them sort of guide us through, how do we analyze this? They couldn't go through this big database and check everything for us. So they sort of guided us in that sense. And this was really important for us later down the line when we came out. So after we did this analysis, we had a couple more front page stories looking at how it applied to marathons, and looking at how athletics was responding to the investigation, which was quite fantastic. But we came under a lot of scrutiny, as you can imagine. How could we have done this analysis on our own? How could this have happened? So what was fascinating is in another series of stories, we got athletes to come forward and agree to release their data. So we went from the biggest drug test leak in history to one of the biggest acts of transparency that you've ever seen in sport, which are athletes coming forward saying, you can release my blood test results. So there's not often that you'll see anyone come forward and say, please release my medical records. That's something very personal to people. But you have athletes coming forward saying, we want to see transparency in the sport. So we had athletes like Mo Farah, Joe Pavey, as you can see, the list kind of goes on. And this was crucial for us because as they agreed to release it, we were able to come out with a lot more around our methodology and what we had done with it. So I just thought I would show this to you because it's an example of how rigorous our analysis was. We didn't just look at an individual blood result and say, that's pretty high according to the experts, this person must be doping. We followed a rigorous level that the IAAF should be doing when they're testing for athletes, which is called a biological passport. So you look at their blood results over time and you see how natural or unnatural it is for their body, for them being male or female, for their altitude, for where they come from. So as you can see, Mo Farah's results over time, they're quite consistent. The white in the middle is sort of this normal range. The gray on the top of the bottom is when we're looking at abnormal levels. I have published up here Gumari because he was already banned, so we can publish his results. These were his results that we had in the database, and you can see these fluctuations over time. So not only were there examples in which they were in these high levels up in the gray areas, above or below, which showed 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 chances of being natural. But these fluctuations are what's really interesting because in our studying and research around this and from the experts, a lot of times what athletes do when they're trying to hide their drugging is they will give themselves a transfusion, pump clean blood into their system. And what it does is it basically spikes their blood kind of up and down. And that's what when you see these big fluctuations, that's a first sign of a transfusion. The really high results are also indicators of other drug use. So being able to come out with this, and we publicly published all of this data, and this was outside the paywall, and sorry, that's why I said publicly, and allowed people to understand the kind of robust nature of what we were doing. And this was crucial for accountability. We were accountable to ourselves, to the data analysis that we had done, and we were questioning the institution. Since then, the doping scandal continues, and this is a story I basically plan to be working on for quite some time. We came out this past weekend, actually, that we found a British doctor who had admitted to doping 150 sports stars, and most of them being footballers. So now doping has moved into, in the UK, to football. And since then, we've been given data leaks now to other sports, which we're currently analyzing, and more analysis will come out of this. So it's been fantastic to see how our team, who we're come to because we can handle data and we can process this, are challenging institutions who have this data and who aren't doing anything about it. This is, like I said, quite interesting. And when we think about the Panama Papers, when we think about WikiLeaks and all of these data leaks that have been coming out, these are databases that already exist. And when we say that this isn't really new and this isn't something that really challenges us, it's because this data is existing at the moment. And I'm finding that at the moment, data journalism as we know it is about challenging what is already there. And in these instances, it's about challenging institutions that are already functioning and should be scrutinizing this. So that's been a great move for us. I'm just going to move on briefly to the general election in the UK. This is a kind of a completely different example of what our team is doing in the newsroom. So not only are we handling data that people couldn't and journalists couldn't handle without us, but we're now bringing really intense statistical rigor to journalism, which we might not have seen before. So in the lead up to the general election in the UK, which was in 2015, our team started to build our own about what we were going to do for this. We wanted to be unique. Everybody was going to be trying to predict the election. Everybody was trying to figure out how we're going to cover this election. So we wanted to be quite unique. And this was the instance where I told you I hired another statistician onto my own. And we said, okay, what are we going to do? So we started building some really intense models around looking at where these people were going. And one of the stories we came out with was this piece here, Voters on the Move, in which you sort of see, we said, okay, let's just start with some basic ideas. We know where people voted in 2010. Where are they going to vote in 2015? And this showed that nearly half of the population was thinking of voting for a different party than before. In the UK, there was a lot of frustration around the Liberal Democrats. They were the party that had pledged to stand by student rates and a series of other things, but they had U-turned a lot on this over the past couple of years. And we're seeing a kind of influx of that. There was a rise of a party called UKIP. There was a lot of interesting things that were happening in politics, and we were able to show through data that this was changing. We broke it down individually through that. So this party UKIP, as I mentioned, you can see where are they pulling people from. We knew people were changing their mind from before, and we could show where they were coming from. And with the Lib Dems, we could see where they were flocking to. People were very frustrated in where they were flocking to. And we were able to show for the first time the data behind these ideas that people already knew about it. And these graphs are also really interesting. I know I talk about how we don't really focus very much on visualization, but in this case, these visualizations are quite unique. They're called Sankey graphs. And I mention this because I talk about having an interdisciplinary team and having people coming from academia, having people come from programming, and it's really fantastic to see where that comes from. But we had someone coming to us from a really interesting area of engineering. So I had an intern on my team at the time that we were working to the election who, like I said, was studying engineering, and she knew we were working on this election bit, and she said, there's these really interesting graphs that can show transition and movement. And we published these charts, and it's completely snowballed after this. My friend Alberto Nardielli at The Guardian started using it for their prediction model. Ipsos Mori, some of the polling companies started using it. And really interesting, you see this academic sort of chart finding its way into newsrooms. And this is what a very unique part that our team is starting to bring to the media. But anyways, this result that we came out with was one of the last times that we ended up using the polling data. As we were going through it and trying to create new findings and find what we were going to do, we noticed that the polls were just awful. The data was not great. The margins were too wide. The predictions were a bit skewed. They were taking really large predictions from the national level down to very small constituencies that didn't have enough sample sizes for. So we made the decision. My statistician said, I don't want to use this data anymore. It's wrong. And you have to remember at this time, polls are all the data that everybody uses when you're covering an election. So we had to make the decision, which for me was easy. To me, I trusted my statistician. I knew they were right. We looked at it. The data wasn't great. Easy decision. We're not going to use polling data. Hard one to enforce because every other newspaper and everyone uses polling data to look at what's going to happen in the election. So, but we decided to stick by it. My boss said to me, "Why do you think you're so special that you need to reject this polling data?" But I walked him through what we had, and he trusted our team, and we stopped using polling data. And you may or may not know, but the day of the election in the UK, the polls had gotten it completely wrong. The Conservatives and Labour were set to be neck and neck in the polls, and the Conservatives took a massive sweep, and they took everything. And we were right. And having a statistical team proved to be quite innovative at the time. But anyways, what we had to do is we still had to cover the election. So we decided to use only data that we could trust. And I mentioned this as well because I know here in Italy there's not a lot of data around that's easy to do data analysis. But we had to say, okay, we don't trust the polls. What do we trust? And we knew we trusted census data. And we knew we had tons of data about people. So we know tons of data about economic background, education background, crime levels, whatever that is across the board. So we decided to build a database about every single constituency with tons and tons of information about it. And then as the results came in on the night, we used a machine learning technique. Like I said, my statistician used this, in which it looks at where do you break? They're called a classification tree. Where does the data break naturally and easily in the data set? And as the results came in, there was some fascinating findings. So as you can kind of see, it kind of trickles down the board. But the first one was, is this constituency in Scotland? 56 of the 59 constituencies there went to the SNP. But the really interesting one after that for us was the data found this. It said, are there more than 17% living in council housing? Housing was one of the strongest indicators that determined the last election. And the data proved this. It uniquely showed in the data that 263 constituencies went to the Conservatives who had this unique number of 17%, meaning people who needed social housing, assistant housing. If they were wealthier than that, and if they didn't need that, if those constituencies didn't have that high percentage, if they had a higher percentage than that, they went to the Conservatives. If it was lower than that, it went to Labour. And that was interesting. We produced this analysis minutes, about 30 minutes after the election. A computer had analyzed the election before a human could do it. And this was revolutionary for our team. It was revolutionary for the Times. And I leave up there at the end of this just saying that we call ourselves of the web, not on the web. An example of what I say, that our team had coined this to say that we're not trying to add additional information up there. We're trying to use the very fabric of it, to use computing and programming to advance accountability, to challenge institutions like the polling industry or FIFA, and to advance accountability. So anyways, I want to thank you for your time, and I'll be very interested if anyone has any questions. Thank you.